The Uses of Enchantment, The Meaning and Importance of Fairy Tales by Bruno Bettelheim, from Part 2, In Fairyland, The Sleeping Beauty. Adolescence is a period of great and rapid change, characterized by periods of utter passivity and lethargy alternating with frantic activity, even dangerous behavior to prove oneself or discharge inner tension. This back-and-forth adolescent behavior finds expression in some fairy tales by the heroes rushing after adventures and then suddenly being turned to stone by some enchantment. More often, and psychologically more correctly, the sequence is reversed. Dummy in the Three Feathers does nothing until he is well into adolescence. And the hero of the Three Languages, pushed by his father to go abroad to develop himself, spends 3 years in passive learning before his adventures begin. While many fairy tales stress great deeds the heroes must perform to become themselves, The Sleeping Beauty emphasizes the long, quiet concentration on oneself that is also needed. During the months before the first menstruation, and often also for some time immediately following it, girls are passive, seem sleepy, and withdrawn to themselves. While no equally noticeable state heralds the coming of sexual maturity in boys, many of them experience a period of lassitude and of turning inward during puberty, which equals the female experience. It is thus understandable that a fairy story in which a long period of sleep begins at the state of puberty has been very popular for a long time among girls and boys. In major life changes such as adolescence, for successful growth opportunities, both active and quiescent periods are needed. The turning inward, which in outer appearances looks like passivity or sleeping one's life away, happens when internal mental processes of such importance go on within the person that he has no energy for outwardly directed action. Those fairy tales which, like Sleeping Beauty, have the period of passivity for their central topic permit the budding adolescent not to worry during this inactive period. He learns that things continue to evolve. The happy ending assures the child that he will not remain permanently stuck in seemingly doing nothing, even if at the moment it seems as if this period of quietude will last for 100 years. After the period of inactivity, which typically occurs during early puberty, adolescents become active and make up for the period of passivity. In real life and in fairy tales, they try to prove their young manhood or womanhood, often through dangerous adventures. This is how the symbolic language of the fairy tale states that after having gathered strength in solitude, they now have to become themselves. Actually, this development is fraught with dangers. An adolescent must leave the security of childhood, which is represented by getting lost in the dangerous forest, learn to face up to his violent tendencies and anxieties, symbolized by encounters with wild animals or dragons, get to know himself, which is implied in meeting strange figures and experiences. Through this process, the adolescent loses a previous innocence, suggested by their having been simpletons, considered dumb and lowly, or merely somebody's child. The risks involved in bold adventures are obvious, as when Jack meets the ogre. Snow White and the Sleeping Beauty encourage the child not to be afraid of the dangers of passivity. Ancient as the Sleeping Beauty is, in many ways it has more important message for today's youth than many other tales. Presently, many of your young people and their parents are fearful of quiet growth when nothing seems to happen, because of a common belief that only doing what can be seen can achieve goals. The Sleeping Beauty tells that a long period of quiescence, of contemplation, of concentration on the self can and often does lead to the highest achievement. Recently, it has been claimed that the struggle against childhood dependency and for becoming oneself in fairy tales is frequently described differently for the girl than for the boy, and that this is the result of sexual stereotyping. Fairy tales do not render such one-sided pictures. Even when a girl is depicted as turning inward in her struggle to become herself, and a boy as aggressively dealing with the external world, these two together symbolize the two ways in which one has to gain selfhood, through learning to understand and master the inner as well as the outer world. In this sense, the male and female heroes are again projections onto two different figures of two artificially separated aspects of one and the same, which everybody has to undergo in growing up. While some literal-minded parents do not realize it, children know that, whatever the sex of the hero, the story pertains to their own problems. Male and female figures appear in the same roles in fairy tales. In The Sleeping Beauty, it is the prince who observes the sleeping girl. But in Cupid and Psyche, and the many tales derived from it, it is Psyche who apprehends Cupid in his sleep and, like the prince, marvels at the beauty she beholds. This is just one example. Since there are thousands of fairy tales, one may safely guess that there are probably equal numbers where the courage and determination of females rescue males, and vice versa. This is as it should be, since fairy tales reveal important truths about life. The Sleeping Beauty is best known today in two different versions, Perrault's and that of the Brothers Grimm. To explain the difference, it may be best to consider briefly the form the story took in Basile's Pentamerone, where its title is Sun, Moon, and Thalia. On the birth of his daughter Thalia, a king asked all the wise men and seers to tell her future. They concluded that she would be exposed to great danger from a splinter of flax. To prevent any such accident, the king ordered that no flax or hemp should ever come into his castle. But one day when Thalia had grown up, she saw an old woman who was spinning past her window. Thalia, who had never seen anything like it before, was therefore delighted with the dancing of the spindle. Made curious, she took the distaff in her hand and began to draw out the thread. A splinter of hemp got under her fingernail, and she immediately fell dead upon the ground. The king left his lifeless daughter seated on a velvet chair in the palace, locked the door, and departed forever to obliterate the memory of his sorrow. Sometime after, another king was hunting. His falcon flew into the window of the empty castle and did not return. The king, trying to find the falcon, wandered in the castle. There he found Thalia, as if asleep, but nothing would rouse her. Falling in love with her beauty, he cohabited with her. Then he left and forgot the whole affair. 9 months later, Thalia gave birth to 2 children, all the time still asleep. They nursed from her breast. Once, when one of the babies wanted to suck, it could not find the breast, but got into its mouth instead the finger that had been pricked. This baby sucked so hard that it drew out the splinter, and Thalia was roused as if from deep sleep. One day the king remembered his adventure and went to see Thalia. He was delighted to find her awake with 2 beautiful children, and from then on they were always on his mind. The king's wife found out his secret, and on the sly sent for the 2 children in the king's name. She ordered them cooked and served to her husband. The cook hid the children in his own home and prepared instead some goat kids, which the queen served to the king. A while later, the queen sent for Thalia and planned to have her thrown into the fire because she was the reason for the king's infidelity. At the last minute, the king arrived, had his wife thrown into the fire, married Thalia, and was happy to find his children, whom the cook had saved. The story ends with the verse, "Lucky people, so 'tis said, are blessed by fortune whilst in bed." Perrault, by adding on his own the story of the slighted fairy who utters the curse, or by using this familiar fairy tale motif, explains why the heroine falls into death-like sleep and thus enriches the story, since in Sun, Moon, and Thalia we are given no reason why this should be her fate. In Basile's story, Thalia is the daughter of a king who loved her so much that he could not remain in the castle after she fell into a death-like sleep. We hear nothing more about him after he left Thalia, ensconced on her throne-like chair under an embroidered canopy, not even after she reawakened, married her king, and lived happily with him and her beautiful children. One king replaces another king in the same country. One king replaces another in Thalia's life. The father king is replaced by the lover king. Might these 2 kings not be substitute for each other at different periods in the girl's life, in different roles and different disguises? We encounter here again the innocence of the Oedipal child who feels no responsibility for what she arouses or wishes to arouse in the parent. Perrault, the academician, doubly distances his story from Basile's. He was, after all, a courtier who told stories for the perusal of princes, pretending that they were invented by his little son to please a princess. The 2 kings are changed into a king and a prince, the latter somebody who obviously is not yet married and has no children. And the presence of the king is separated from the prince by a sleep of 100 years so that we can feel certain that the 2 have nothing in common. Interestingly enough, Perrault does not quite manage to extricate himself from the Oedipal connotations. In his story, the queen is not insanely jealous because of the betrayal by her husband, but she appears as the Oedipal mother who is so jealous of the girl her son, the prince, falls in love with that she seeks to destroy her. But while the queen in Basile's tale is convincing, Perrault's queen is not. His story falls into 2 incongruous parts, a first which ends with the prince's awakening Sleeping Beauty and marrying her, followed by a second part in which we are suddenly told that the mother of Prince Charming is really a child-devouring ogress who wishes to eat her own grandchildren. In Basile, the queen wishes to feed his children to her husband. the most terrible punishment for preferring Sleeping Beauty to her that she can think of. In Perrault, she wants to eat them herself. In Basile, the queen is jealous because her husband's mind and love are entirely taken up with Talia and her children. The king's wife tries to burn Talia in the fire, the king's burning love for Talia having aroused the queen's burning hatred for her. There is no explanation for the cannibalistic hatred of the queen in Perrault's tale, but that she is an ogress who, whenever she saw little children passing by, had all the difficulty in the world to avoid falling upon them. Also, Prince Charming keeps his marriage to Sleeping Beauty a secret for 2 years until his father dies. Only then does he bring Sleeping Beauty and her 2 children, called Morning and Day, to his castle. And although he knows that his mother is an ogress, when he leaves to go to war, he puts her in charge, entrusting his kingdom and wife and children to her. Perrault's story ends with the king returning at the moment when his mother is just about to have Sleeping Beauty thrown into a pit full of vipers. On his arrival, the ogress, who sees her plan spoiled, jumps into the pit herself. It can easily be understood that Perrault did not feel it appropriate to tell at the French court a story in which a married king ravishes a sleeping maiden, gets her with child, forgets it entirely, and remembers her after a time only by chance. But a fairy prince who keeps his marriage and fatherhood a secret from his father king, shall we assume because he fears the king's Oedipal jealousy if the son also becomes a father, is unconvincing, if for no other reason than that Oedipal jealousy of mother and father in regard to the same son in the same tale is overdoing it even in a fairy story. Knowing his mother is an ogress, the prince does not bring his wife and child home as long as his good father may exercise a restraining influence, but only after his death when such protection is no longer available. The reason for all this is not that Perrault was lacking in artistry, but that he did not take his fairy stories seriously and was most intent on the cute or moralistic verse ending he appended to each. With 2 such incongruous parts to this story, it is understandable that in oral telling, and often also in printed form, the story ends with a happy union of the prince and Sleeping Beauty. It is this form that the Brothers Grimm heard and recorded, and which was then and is now most widely known. Still, something got lost which was present in Perrault. To wish death to a newborn child only because one is not invited to the christening or is given inferior silverware is the mark of an evil fairy. Thus, in Perrault, as in the Brothers Grimm's version, at the very beginning of the story, we find the fairy godmothers split into the good and the evil aspects. The happy ending requires that the evil principle be appropriately punished and done away with. Only then can the good and with it happiness prevail. In Perrault as in Basile, the evil principle is done away with, and thus fairy story justice is done. But the Brothers Grimm's version, which will be followed from here on, is deficient because the evil fairy is not punished. However great the variations in detail, the central theme of all versions of The Sleeping Beauty is that despite all attempts on the part of the parents to prevent their child's sexual awakening, it will take place nonetheless. Furthermore, parents' ill-advised efforts may postpone the reaching of maturity at the proper time, as symbolized by Sleeping Beauty's 100 years of sleep, which separate her sexual awakening from her being united with her lover. Closely related to this is a different motif, namely that to have to wait even a long time for sexual fulfillment does not at all detract from its beauty. Perrault's and the Brothers Grimm's versions begin by indicating that one may have to wait a long time to find sexual fulfillment, as indicated by having a child. For a very long time, we are told, the king and his queen wished for a child in vain. In Perrault, the parents behave like his contemporaries. They went to all the waters in the world, vows, pilgrimages, everything was tried, and nothing came of it. At last, however, the queen was with child. The Brothers Grimm's beginning is much more fairy tale-like. Once upon a time was a king and a queen who said every day, "Oh, if we only had a child." But they never got one. Once, when the queen sat in the bath, it happened that a frog crawled out of the water on the land and told her, "Your wish will be fulfilled. Before a year is over, you'll bring a daughter into the world." The frog's saying that the queen will give birth before a year is over puts the time of waiting close to the 9 months of pregnancy. This, plus the queen's being in her bath, is a reason to believe that the conception took place on the occasion of the frog's visit to the queen. Why, in fairy tales, the frog often symbolizes sexual fulfillment is discussed later in connection with the story The Frog King. The parents' long wait for a child which finally arrives conveys that there is no need to hurry towards sex. It loses none of its reward if one has to wait a long time for it. The good fairies and their wishes at the christening actually have little to do with the plot, except to contrast with the curse of the fairy who feels slighted. This may be seen from the fact that the number of fairies varies from country to country, from 3 to 8 to 13. The good fairy's gifts of endowment to the child also differ in different versions, while the curse on the evil one is always the same. The girl in the Brothers Grimm's story, when she is 15, will prick her finger on a distaff of a spinning wheel and die. The last good fairy is able to change this threat of death into 100 years' sleep. The message is similar to that of Snow White. What may seem like a period of death-like passivity at the end of childhood is nothing but a time of quiet growth and preparation, from which the person will awaken mature, ready for sexual union. It must be stressed that in fairy tales this union is as much one of the minds and souls of two partners as it is one of sexual fulfillment. In times past, 15 was often the age at which menstruation began. The 13 fairies in Brothers Grimm's story are reminiscent of the 13 lunar months into which the year was once in ancient times divided. While this symbolism may be lost on those not familiar with the lunar year, it is well known that menstruation typically occurs with the 28-day frequency of lunar months, and not with the 12 months which our year is divided into. Thus, the number of 12 good fairies plus a 13th evil one indicates symbolically that the fatal curse refers to menstruation. It is very much to the point that the king, the male, does not understand the necessity of menstruation and tries to prevent his daughter from experiencing the fatal bleeding. The queen, in all versions of the story, seems unconcerned with the prediction of the angry fairy. In any case, she knows better than to try to prevent it. The curse centers on the distaff, a word which in English has come to stand for female in general. While the same is not true for the French Perrault or German Brothers Grimm word for distaff, until fairly recently spinning and weaving were considered as characteristically women's occupations. All the king's painstaking efforts to forestall the curse of the malicious fairy fail. Removing all the distaffs from the kingdom cannot prevent the girl's fateful bleeding once she reaches puberty, at 15 as the evil fairy predicted. Whatever precautions a father takes, when the daughter is ripe for it, puberty will set in. The temporary absence of both parents when this event occurs symbolizes all parents' incapacity to protect their child against the various growing up crises which every human being has to undergo. As she becomes an adolescent, the girl explores the formerly inaccessible areas of existence, as represented by the hidden chamber where an old woman is spinning. At this point, the story abounds in Freudian symbolism. As she approaches the fateful place, the girl ascends a circular staircase. In dreams, such staircases typically stand for sexual experiences. At the top of the staircase, she finds a small door and in its lock, a key. As she turns the key, the door springs open and the girl enters a small room in which an old woman spins. A small locked room often stands in dreams for the female sexual organs. Turning a key in a lock often symbolizes intercourse. Seeing the old woman spinning, the girl asks, "What kind of thing is this that jumps about so funnily?" It does not take much imagination to see the possible sexual connotations in the distaff, but as soon as the girl touches it, she pricks her finger and falls into sleep. The main associations this tale arouses in the child's unconscious are to menstruation rather than intercourse. In common language, referring also to its biblical origin, menstruation is often called the curse, and it is a female's, the fairy's, curse that causes the bleeding. Second, the age at which this curse is to become effective is about the age at which, in past times, menstruation most frequently set in. Finally, the bleeding comes about through an encounter with an old woman, not a man, and according to the Bible, the curse is inherited by woman from woman. Bleeding, as in menstruation, is for the young girl, and for the young man too in a different manner, an overwhelming experience if she is not emotionally ready for it. Overcome by the experience of sudden bleeding, the princess falls into a long sleep, protected against all suitors, i.e. premature sexual encounters, by an impenetrable wall of thorns. While the most familiar version stresses in the name the Sleeping Beauty, the long sleep of the heroine, the titles of other variant gives prominence to the protective wall, such as the English Briar Rose. Many princes try to reach Sleeping Beauty before her time of maturing is over. All these precocious suitors perish in the thorns. This is a warning to child and parents that sexual arousal before mind and body are ready for it is very destructive. But when Sleeping Beauty has finally gained both physical and emotional maturity and is ready for love and with it for sex and marriage, then that which has seemed impenetrable gives way. The wall of thorns suddenly turns into a wall of big, beautiful flowers, which opens to let the prince enter. The implied message is the same as in many other fairy tales. Don't worry and don't try to hurry things. When the time is ripe, the impossible problem will be solved as if all by itself. The long sleep of the beautiful maiden has also other connotations. Whether it is Snow White in her glass coffin or Sleeping Beauty on her bed, the adolescent dream of everlasting youth and perfection is just that, a dream. The alteration of the original curse, which threatened death, to one of prolonged sleep, suggests that the two are not at all different. If we do not want to change and develop, then we might as well remain in a death-like sleep. During their sleep, the heroine's beauty is a frigid one. Theirs is the isolation of narcissism. In such self-involvement, which excludes the rest of the world, there is no suffering, but also no knowledge to be gained, no feelings to be experienced. Any transition from one stage of development to the next is fraught with dangers. Those of puberty are symbolized by the shedding of blood on touching the distaff. A natural reaction to the threat of having to grow up is to withdraw from the world and life which impose such difficulties. Narcissistic withdrawal is a tempting reaction to the stresses of adolescence, but the story warns it leads to a dangerous, death-like existence when it is embraced as an escape from the vagaries of life. The entire world then becomes dead to the person. This is the symbolic meaning and warning of the death-like sleep into which everybody surrounding Sleeping Beauty falls. The world becomes alive only to the person who herself awakens to it. Only relating positively to the other awakens us from the danger of sleeping away our life. The kiss of the prince breaks the spell of narcissism and awakens a womanhood which up to then has remained underdeveloped. Only if the maiden grows into a woman can life go on. The harmonious meeting of prince and princess, their awakening to each other, is a symbol of what maturity implies, not just harmony within oneself, but also with the other. It depends on the listener whether the arrival of the prince at the right time is interpreted as the event which causes sexual awakening or the birth of a higher ego. The child probably comprehends both these meanings. Awakening from a long sleep will be understood differently by the child depending on his age. The younger child will see it in mainly an awakening to his selfhood, the achievement of concordance between what had been his inner chaotic tendencies, that is, an attaining of inner harmony between his id, ego, and superego. After the child has experienced this meaning until he reaches puberty in adolescence, he will gain additional understanding of the same fairy tale. Then it becomes also an image of achieving harmony with the other, as represented by a person of the other sex, so that the two, as told at the end of Sleeping Beauty, may live enjoyably together till their end. This, the most desirable goal of life, seems to be the most significant communication which fairy stories transmit to the older child. It is symbolized by an ending in which the prince and princess find each other and they lived happily until their death. Only after one has attained inner harmony within oneself can one hope to find its relations with others. A preconscious understanding of the connection between the two stages is gained by the child through his own developmental experiences. The story of Sleeping Beauty impresses every child that a traumatic event, such as the girl's bleeding at the beginning of puberty and later in first intercourse, does have the happiest consequences. The story implants the idea that such events must be taken very seriously, but that one need not be afraid of them. The curse is a blessing in disguise. One more look at the earliest known form of the motif of the Sleeping Beauty in Persephorus. Some 600 years ago, it is Venus, the goddess of love, who arranges for the sleeping girl's awakening by having her baby suck the splinter out of her finger, and the same happens in Basile's story. Full self-fulfillment of the female does not come with menstruation. Female completeness is not achieved when falling in love, not even in intercourse, nor in childbirth, since the heroines in Persephorus and in Basile's story sleep all through it. These are necessary steps on the way to ultimate maturity, but complete selfhood comes only with having given life and with nurturing the one whom one has brought into being with the baby sucking from the mother's body. Thus, these stories enumerate experiences which pertain only to the female. She must undergo them all before she reaches the summit of femininity. It is the infant's sucking the splinter out from under the mother's nail which brings her back to life, a symbol that her child is not just the passive recipient of what the mother gives to him, but that he also actively renders her great service. Her nurturing permits him to do so, but it is his nursing from her which reawakens her to life, a being reborn, which, as always in fairy tales, symbolizes the achievement of a higher mental state. Thus, the fairy tale tells parent and child alike that the infant not only receives from his mother, but also gives to her. While she gives him life, he adds a new dimension to her life. The self-involvement which was suggested by the heroine's long-lasting sleep comes to an end as she gives to the infant, and he, by taking from her, restores her to the highest level of existence, a mutuality in which the one who receives life also gives life. In The Sleeping Beauty, this is further emphasized because not only she, but her entire world, her parents, all inhabitants of the castle, returns to life the moment she does. If we are insensitive to the world ceases to exist for us. When Sleeping Beauty fell asleep, so did the world for her. The world awakens anew as a child is nurtured into it, because only in this way can humanity continue to exist. This symbolism got lost in the story's later forms, which end with the awakening of Sleeping Beauty and with it her world to a new life. Even in the shortened form in which the tale came down to us, in which Sleeping Beauty is awakened by the kiss of the prince, we feel, without it being spelled out as in the more ancient versions, that she is the incarnation of perfect femininity.